On to Canada. Members of Canada's Aboriginal communities and rights activists have staged coordinated protests across the nation, as well as in other countries, including the United States and in Australia. The Global Day of Action has been seen as a sign that the movement pushing for the rights of the Native population is gaining momentum.
Canada's freezing winter weather is not stopping supporters of Aboriginal rights from voicing their discontent. Supporters of Aboriginal rights made good on their pledge to increase pressure on the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Protests were held in dozens of Canadian cities as well as in other countries including Australia and the US. Organizers say the Global Day of Action is meant to protest the Canadian government's attacks on democracy, Indigenous sovereignty, human rights, and environment protection. Observers believe that the latest protests indicate that the Canadian government's defiance to meet the demands of the Aboriginal communities is provoking more protests.
Something unprecedented in Canada's history. Around the world, from Sweden to Sydney, from Greenland to Las Vegas, global citizens were protesting the Harper government's crimes against the Aboriginal peoples of this country. Obviously, there's a global dimension to this.
Canada's native population mostly lives in lands allotted to them known as reservations. There, the Aboriginals have to deal with tough conditions ranging from unsafe drinking water and inadequate housing to addiction and high suicide rates. Aboriginal chiefs and activists say they're pushing for something beyond government handouts. They say they want concrete measures by Ottawa to improve the lives of the very first owners of the country. The Natives are accusing the government of not respecting the laws that were once supposed to protect the rights of Aboriginals after their land was colonized by Britain.
Well, you have to understand that the Harper government doesn't respect Aboriginal sovereignty. He wants Aboriginals just to assimilate into Canadian society and be treated like any other Canadian. But there has been legal provisions in Canada's legal frameworks to allow for Canada's Aboriginals to have special treatment. So it's not just we're all individuals under the law, but that there's some recognition that there's been this crime of colonization and that these are the original peoples of Canada.
Aboriginal activists say through their protests, they're seeking to make the government respect their rights. So far, they've shown that more defiance on the part of the government will make the Native communities more determined in their struggle.
We'll take back what we want. We'll take back what we have. We'll take back our waters and our land. It's our future we're fighting for. I don't know more.
Well, who better to talk about this? Our correspondent Joshua Blakeney has been following this story, and you just saw him in that report there. Joins us from Calgary. Joshua Blakeney, we're looking at a gain in this movement in its different forms, different groups coming out. If you can please tell us why this time, this year, at this point, this has reached the momentum that it has. 30 cities across Canada, not to mention in the United States, and also a couple other towns within the U.S.
Yes, Keller. Obviously, this is unprecedented in Canada's history. Your question was slightly cut off there, but I got most of it. This is unprecedented in Canada's history. Obviously, Canada used to be loved in the world, not necessarily for what it was, but for what it was not. It was not like, for example, the behemoth United States to itself intervening in other countries, committing violations of human rights and so on. And yet, today, or yesterday, on January 28th, we saw the ubiquity of protests throughout the world, from Sydney, Australia, to Greenland, to Sweden, to Las Vegas. There were protests all around the world, effectively against protesting Canada's government. I mean, this would have been unheard of even 10 years ago, and it's an indictment of the Harper government's policies. I think many in the world are seeing Canada and its foreign policy intervening in other parts of the world, and just as they disrespect the principle of self-determination in its foreign policy, the Harper government appears to be violating the legally enshrined defense of First Nations self-determination in Canada. And Canada's First Nations, it's kind of been the straw that broke the camel's back. This latest omnibus bill, Bill C-45, which is effectively paving the way for doing away with those very collective rights which have allowed Canada's First Nations to retain their integrity for this long. And so we've seen global protests against the Harper government. We've seen the Harper government this week, interestingly, send special forces into Mali, and so they have money to go around the world setting fire to other people's countries, and yet the First Nations peoples I was with today were telling me about third world conditions on their reservations, which lead to all kinds of problems like suicide and illiteracy and malnutrition. And so I think many people in Canada are actually very grateful that Canada's Aboriginal peoples are defending all of our interests. I know that I interviewed, for example, today some Caucasian, non-Aboriginal Canadians, and they use phrases like that the Aboriginal people are saving us from ourselves because they are so alert to the impositions of the Harper government and the encroachment on democracy in this country that they're the ones on the front line defending all of our interests. Of course, this omnibus bill that the Harper government has been passing, it rams together all kinds of things.
Right. Unfortunately, we're just fresh out of time. But thank you so much for that. Joshua Blakeney there, our correspondent from Calgary. We appreciate that. Moving on with news from Egypt, the escalating violence in that country has prompted a stern warning from the country's defense minister. General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi says the political turmoil could result in the collapse of the state. General al-Sisi has said that Egypt is facing a real threat to its security. He noted that the army's deployment along the Suez Canal is aimed at protecting the key route. On Monday night, protesters defied an overnight curfew in the rest of towns along the canal. The curfew was imposed by President Mohamed Morsi to end days of clashes that have left at least